we're able to learn a lot about how the present at hand functions work. We really can learn a lot about how something's going to fly through the air if we restrict ourselves to looking at things like present at hand. But we're going to miss, oh, this was thrown in order to hit someone in the head. We're going to miss all of the interactions of Dasein and the ready to hand, which are the most primordial, the most basic. I'm really interested in that. I think I just get a lot of interesting things to say about philosophy of science, but it's not what he focuses on, so I should probably move on. So what's really important to understand is that readiness to hand is not an attribute of things that are primarily discovered as present at hand. I think that's a direct quote from Heidegger. That what we explicitly don't have here is a bunch of present at hand stuff which is sitting around, which then Dasein comes in and assigns ready to hand attributes to. We don't have something that is fundamentally wood pulp that then this outside force comes and forces into this category of ready to hand. What we've got instead is something that is primordially ready to hand, which we can then decide to look at as present at hand. And the way you can see this is that there are the readiness to hand is fundamental for the way we view the world. Insofar as, look at a video game. How many of you have played like World of Warcraft or like any sort of MMORPG? Like, in that game, there's equipment. Literally, there's loot. And you go around and like, the stuff in the world you're not really paying attention to until some loot pops up on the ground. And there's a fundamentally different reaction you have to that than you did to all the trees in the background and everything else. You don't look at that and say, oh, that is part of the flashing lights on my screen, or even, oh, that is part of the scenery. You could then say, oh, I can use that. Oh, that is something I need to go and get. And so the interaction, so I think MMORPGs are actually really interesting because they force you to look at certain things as present at hand. There is stuff you just cannot click on. You cannot use the trees in the background to do anything, depending. Often you can't. And so when something is ready to hand, when things are working the way they normally do, when there is something and you can actually use it, there is a very particular sort of interaction you have with that thing. And so because of that, you could try to set up a system where you talked about how the things were fundamentally flashing lights, and then, somehow the attribute of this certain set of flashing lights was that it had an equipmental character. But that's going about things a little bit backwards. The way we actually interact with things, the way things appear to us, is as having use, is as the ready to hand. And then if we want to go and say, okay, but what is this actually physically composed of, we can do that. He's not saying you can't. He's just saying that's secondary. That's not the way we actually interact with the world. So this is the structure of the being of objects, of stuff, of the world. But I've left something crucial out. We've talked about using things for something. But how does all of this, what he calls assignment, get decided? How do we know what we're going to use and for what? And the way it does so is through what he calls the structure of care, which is just his term for the fundamental way Dasein exists, the fundamental way Dasein interacts with things. So, Dasein, in its very nature, I said at the beginning, it was a being whose being is an issue to it. It is, he also says it's its own most possibility. Dasein interacts with the world for its own sake. There's the structure of, I pick up the hammer so that I can hammer something. I want to hammer it because I want it to be fastened to this other thing. I want it to be fastened because it's part of this larger project for building a house. I want to build a house so I will get the money. I want to have the money so I can feed my family. Eventually this is going to have to stop. This can't continue forever. And where it stops is because that is what it is. That is what it is to be me. That is what it is to be this Dasein. That feeding my family is part of what it is to be me. That my own Dasein contains this ownmost possibility, this, also calls it for the sake of which, for the sake of which everything else is done. So Dasein interacts with the world using this equipment for its own sake, for the sake of which. Again, though, we might have a question. Well, how does that happen? Heidegger thinks that the most common way for this to happen is exactly what we were kind of talking about earlier that I said I was going to talk about later, and that is what we've been calling culture. That's not what Heidegger would call it. Heidegger calls it das Man. This book translates it as the they. I think the one might be better, as in one does this, or they do that. Bert Dreyfus, who I've listened to some of his lectures, likes the one better, and I think I agree with him. The one in the sense of one does this. It's not a particular one who does it this way. It's just part of the structure of being a Dasein in a particular place and time. That's really President Ham talking, sorry. But it's part of being a Dasein in a particular situation. To have this understanding of what it is to be a Dasein. And so, this is, Heidegger thinks this is the general way people act. They act in relationship to a world of equipment, a totality of equipment, in such a way as to reach their own, the for the sake of which, where the for the sake of which is defined by the one, the culture. And he thinks this is the general structure of the way Dasein interacts with the world. But it's not the most authentic one. Heidegger makes this distinction between inauthentic and authentic, where authentic basically just means understanding oneself as fully as possible. The most authentic way is to realize that you are Dasein, that you have this ability to seize possibilities, and to choose to do that in your own way, in a way that is not determined by the culture. And this is what the authentic world is. This is where Heidegger has ties to existentialism. He would have hated to be called an existentialist, but he basically is. That Dasein could decide its own meaning. It generally doesn't. It generally lets the culture do that. But it has the ability to decide its own meaning. And therefore the meaning of the world as this Dasein interacts with it. Because everything has this in order to structure that leads to the ultimate for the sake of which. So I want to talk about one more thing, and then we'll see what we can do with this stuff. Because right now I've just been throwing a lot of definitions at you, and just basically been making claims. And the way we're going to evaluate this is by seeing whether these are useful categories to have. But first I want to talk about one other thing, that's interpretation. That's what Heidegger claims he's doing in this whole work. He thinks this is an interpretation of being. So it's important to understand what he means by interpretation. And as with everything in Heidegger, it has a structure of 3 parts. He likes 3. And there's actually an important reason for that. He's specifically that it's all related to past, present, and future. That's what the second half of the book is about. But anyway, we don't want to talk about that because that's even more complicated. But it has a structure of 3. In an interpretation, something that is understood, and his definition of understood is can be used in a meaningful way. So you understand a hammer if you pick it up and hammer with it. That is proof that you understand it. So anything that is understood can be can have this like structure applied to it. And there are 3 things. For having. So it's inside of an understanding. So if the thing we're going to talk about is in something we understand, is part of our world. We have a foresight of it, by which he means we take the first, he uses the phrase take the first cut. We look at it and like get some idea of how we're going to interpret it just by like what it is and how we understand it. But importantly, there's a foreconception, which is a definite way of conceiving it.